Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorable Steve Leifman.
Good morning, San Antonio. What a beautiful city you have here. Thank you so much for hosting us, and particularly I want to thank you for having me here this morning. I'll tell you, when I became a judge, I had no idea I was actually becoming the gatekeeper to the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida, the Miami-Dade County Jail. Every day, our courts, our jails, our law enforcement agencies are witness to what I call a parade of misery brought on by untreated mental illness. Because of the lack of access to community-based care, our police, our corrections officers, our law enforcement have increasingly become the lone responders to people with mental illnesses in crisis. In fact, the jails and prisons in this nation are now the largest psychiatric facilities for our nation. There was a study that came out just 2 weeks ago that said that people with mental illnesses are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than hospitalized. What a horrible commentary on our state of affairs for people with mental illnesses. I'm going to begin with a short video that was produced by my local CBS affiliate that I believe captures the situation all too well. It's a sobering way to start our conference, but I don't think there's a better response to this gentleman's anguish than something will change, and that is you. My journey into the mental health world began one morning when I was getting ready to go on the bench. I was approached by the assistant public defender and the assistant state attorney, and they asked me if I would speak to a couple whose son was in jail on a minor offense. At the time, I was handling what we call our jail division, which is where people who have been charged with misdemeanors and are still incarcerated, their cases are handled. This gentleman, I think, was on some serious offense like possession of a dairy cart. And his parents came in and they were horribly distraught. The mom was crying. They started to beg me to get their son treatment. I was a relatively new judge at the time, and I will tell you, as new judges, we think we have a lot more power than we do, and we think we have a lot more wisdom than we do. And I made the mistake of promising them that I would get their son help. See, I'm a lawyer, I'm trained in logic, and the logic would dictate that if someone got arrested and they were sick, that of course we'd get them treatment, because that would make sense. I had no idea, because we were not trained in this area either, that there really wasn't a very strong community mental health system that was capable of taking care of people with severe mental illnesses. The parents went on and told me that their son was a brilliant man. He'd gone to Harvard, he had a late onset of schizophrenia, and was now recycling through the criminal justice system, and they just didn't know what to do. I listened to their story. I felt terribly sad for them. I got up to go back into the courtroom, and the mom stopped me. She said, "Judge, there's one more thing I want to tell you about my son. He's the former head of psychiatry at Jackson Memorial Hospital. That's our largest public hospital in Florida. And he's brilliant, and he knows the system better than most, and he's going to try to manipulate you." I went into the courtroom, I called his case, and sure enough, he was brilliant. Except for looking like a homeless man and handcuffed, he sounded very much and every bit the Harvard-educated doctor he was. We started to talk, and he was amazingly appropriate. He was articulate, he was thoughtful. And I was sitting there thinking, my God, maybe there's something wrong with his parents. He was more appropriate and nicer than the lawyers. Didn't talk back. And he said, "Judge, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not sick. Because if you want me to go out for an evaluation, I'll be happy to do that." And I'm thinking, he's only in on possession of a dairy cart. He's probably not much of a threat. He's already been in jail a couple weeks on this minor offense. And I said to him, "I just have one question for you." I said, "Anything, Your Honor." I said, "I just don't understand. If you really don't have a mental illness, why would a Harvard-educated doctor be homeless and recycling through the criminal justice system?" Well, whatever I said triggered a crisis. And all of a sudden, he started putting his hands over his ears, and he started shaking, and he started pointing to the back of the courtroom, and he had this look of horrible, horrible terror. He said, Your Honor, before I go any further, you have to remove that couple," pointing to his parents. I said, "Aren't those your parents?" He said, No, Your Honor. My real parents, they died in the Holocaust, and these are imposters. They came from the CIA, and they're here to get me today. You have to save me." I immediately did what I was taught to do, which wasn't much. That if someone acts strange or peculiar in the courtroom, you order a psychological evaluation. First evaluation came back. He was incompetent to stand trial. I'm thinking, this is wonderful. I'm going to fulfill the promise I made to his parents. I'm going to get him help. We'll live happily ever after. Of course, we needed 3 evaluations. I ordered 2 more. All 3 evaluations came back. He was incompetent to stand trial. He's now in jail 6-8 weeks on possession of a dairy cart. I called the lawyers. I asked them to stipulate to his evaluations, which of course they do, and I began to order him into involuntary hospitalization. All of a sudden, I notice the assistant public defender has a little grin on her face. Now, I'll tell you, I'm a former assistant public defender, and the grin is a bad thing. And she then utters those words that you all will appreciate in this room. She says, "Your Honor, in all due respect." Now, when a lawyer says that to a judge, it has nothing to do with respect. It means, "Judge, you don't have a clue what you're doing." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Your Honor, you just can't do that." And she whips out a Florida State Supreme Court opinion, which, of course, since we had no training, I had never read or heard of. And it said, "County court judges had absolutely no legal authority to involuntarily hospitalize anybody." And my only option was to basically release this man back to the street without any treatment. Not only was I unable to fulfill the promise that I made to his parents, I put my community at risk. And I put him at risk. I will tell you, we do not become judges to be part of that kind of problem. I went back to my chambers, I picked up the phone, I started making calls, and I learned 3 very, very valuable lessons that morning. The first I learned is that Miami-Dade County had a mental health crisis. As it turned out, 9.1% of our general population, making it the largest population of any urban area in the United States, has the highest percentage of mental illness. It's almost 200,000 people. And because the state of Florida was only providing treatment to only 13% of them, our jail had become the largest psychiatric facility in Florida. 3 of 9 floors were mental health floors. We spend almost $160,000 every single day. That's almost $60 million a year to warehouse people in our jail in Miami-Dade County. And because we had done such a lousy job training our law enforcement on how to deal with this situation, since 1999, we had 20 people with mental illnesses die during an encounter with the police. The second lesson I learned that this was not just a local, but a state and national problem as well. Former Surgeon General David Satcher calls mental illness the silent epidemic of our times. But if you're in law enforcement or if you work in the criminal justice system, you know there is absolutely nothing silent about this problem. And the third lesson, and maybe the most difficult lesson I learned, is that we have an old, fragmented community system of care that was never built to handle people with the highest acuity of mental illnesses. And they continue to fall into the criminal justice system. When our country was first founded, we didn't know what to do with people with mental illnesses. So family members would take them down to the local jail and drop them off. And our jails were the first psychiatric facilities in this country. And it remained this way until the early 1800s, when a wonderful woman, Dorothea Dix, a nun from Boston, was visiting a Boston jail, and she came across 14 men who were literally freezing to death in the jail. She went to see the jailer, and she said, "Excuse me, who are these men? Why are you treating them this way?" And he said, "Oh, lady, why are you bothering me? They're just a bunch of lunatics," because that's what we called people with mental illnesses back then. He goes, "They didn't commit any offenses. I'm not getting paid to treat them. What do you want me to do?" Well, this one woman, this one person, started an entire national movement, ironically called moral treatment. And the idea was to take people from these horrible jails and put them in some kind of hospital setting. Pretty progressive for 1800. And because of her effort, by 1900, every state in the Union had a psychiatric facility. But sadly, there was no oversight, there was no regulation. And these facilities became houses of horror. They became human experimentation facilities. They found, for instance, that people with mental illnesses had slightly elevated blood sugar levels, so they said, aha, they must be diabetics, and that's what's causing their insanity. So they went around and they started giving people insulin shock therapy as the first treatment in this nation. Of course, they weren't diabetic. People got sick. People died. They said, you know what? Maybe we can just shock them back into sanity. So they started using electric shock therapy without any controls, without any systems. And more people died. And when all failed, they said, you know what? We're just going to cut a piece of the brain out, do a lobotomy, and that will be the standard treatment. And this went on, believe it or not, up until almost 1970. Well, in what would become his last public bill signing, in 1963, President Kennedy signed a National Community Mental Health Act. And the idea was to take people from these horrible hospitals and return them slowly into the community with a system of care. $3 billion were actually authorized in 1963 to fund this program. But sadly and tragically, due to the president's assassination and the escalation of the Vietnam War, not one penny of the $3 billion ever got appropriated. But at the same time, a whole slew of lawsuits got filed. The first one came out of Alabama. And the courts basically ordered the state of Alabama to either improve their facility or they were going to shut it down. Well, they ran out of money as they began to improve it. The judge was nobody to mess with, and he shut it down. The case went to the United States Supreme Court. It was basically affirmed, and overnight there was a shockwave in this nation. If you had a state psychiatric facility, you had two options. You could spend billions of dollars to upgrade it to treat people humanely, or you could shut it down and provide community-based treatment. Well, what do you think the states did? They closed those facilities about as fast as they possibly could. And sadly, the president's national community system was never funded. The impact has been absolutely staggering. In 1955, there were some 560,000 people in state psychiatric hospitals around this country. Using today's population, it would be closer to 1 million. Today, we have fewer than 40,000 beds left. Last year, 1.1 million people in this country with serious mental illnesses were arrested. On any given day, we have almost 400,000 people with mental illnesses in jail and prison, and another 900,000 on some kind of community control. Two horrible and sad ironies to this story. Number one is we never deinstitutionalized. What we in fact did is we transinstitutionalized. We transferred people from these really horrible, crappy hospitals to these really horrible jails, giving people criminal records, making it more difficult for them to recover, because we all know with a criminal record it's harder to get housing, it's harder to get employment.